Welcome back, everyone. Thanks for tuning in again as we delve deeper into the Backpacker murders.
Absolutely.
Today, we're going to be going through like a really detailed timeline of everything we know about this case.
Yeah, I think that's so important to get a clear picture of everything, right?
Yeah. And it's, obviously a really heavy topic.
Absolutely.
And we're going to treat it with the respect that it deserves. So we'll just jump right into it, I guess.
Yeah, let's do it.
So starting with, this is going to start in January 1990 with Paul Onions.
Okay.
He was a 24-year-old British backpacker traveling around Australia.
Right.
And he had taken a train out to the outskirts of Sydney, and he was hitchhiking.
Mm-hmm.
And he was intending to head towards Mildura.
Okay.
And this was over the Australia day-long weekend.
Gotcha.
And he was offered a lift by Ivan Milat.
Right.
And it's, it's just like, it's really interesting how things can seem so normal on the surface.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then turn really sinister really quickly. And so, yeah, he was offered this lift by Ivan Milat. And Milat seemed actually pretty normal at first. Onions even said that he thought Milat looked a bit like the cricketer Dennis Lillee.
Interesting.
But as they were driving south of Sydney, they were heading toward the Southern Highlands.
Mm-hmm. And
that would be towards the turnoff for the Belanglo State Forest.
Right.
Which is, obviously we know now how significant that place is.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But Milat's demeanor completely changed.
Okay.
He started making like a lot of anti-immigrant remarks.
Oh, wow.
Which really unsettled Onions immediately.
Right. I mean, you got to be wondering at that point, were the victims specifically targeted because they were foreign, or was it just that they were vulnerable because they were travelers? Like, that seems like a key question.
Yeah, and actually, I mean, the sources that we have do indicate that, most of the victims were foreign travelers.
Right.
So that sentiment that Milat was expressing could definitely have been a factor in his targeting.
Absolutely.
But yeah, Onions was starting to get a really bad feeling about the whole situation.
Of course.
And then Milat started slowing down the car and constantly checking his rearview mirror.
Oh, that's creepy.
So, that was just making Onions more and more uncomfortable. And then Milat said he needed to pull over to get some cassettes from under the seat.
Huh.
And the thing is, there were cassettes right there between them.
Oh, really? Wow. So it seems like he was trying to manufacture a reason to stop.
Yeah, it seems that way.
And to, isolate his victim.
Exactly.
And the fact that the cassettes were right there in plain sight, I mean, that shows you just how, weak that excuse was.
Yeah.
It wasn't even believable.
Yeah, totally. So the first time Milat actually stopped the car, Onions decided to get out to stretch his legs.
Okay.
And Milat, immediately was like, why did you get out of the car?
Oh, wow.
So it's almost as if he needed Onions to stay in the vehicle.
Right. So it seems like control is a major element in this kind of crime. If the victim does anything that the perpetrator doesn't expect, that can make them anxious and, escalate things.
Totally. So, yeah, Onions got back in the car. I mean, he obviously sensed that something was off, but he couldn't have fully grasped the danger he was in at that point.
Yeah, you'd think.
And then just a little bit further down the road, Milat pulls over again.
Oh, no.
And he uses the same excuse about needing to find tapes.
Wow.
But this time he pulls out a revolver and a length of rope.
Oh, my gosh.
And that's when Onions realized how serious the situation really was.
Yeah, so that was the turning point. He was pretending to look for music, but then, bam, there's a gun and a rope.
Yeah. And can you imagine going from, a completely normal car ride to that?
I can't even imagine.
It must have been absolutely terrifying. And he basically just bolted out of the car and ran for his life.
Oh, wow.
Down the Hume Highway.
Down the highway.
Yeah, down the highway.
Oh, my God.
And Milat is shouting after him and even firing shots at him.
Oh, my gosh.
So other cars, other drivers, saw what was happening and they slowed down. But then they sped off, out of fear for their own safety.
Oh, wow.
So, it's kind of like a dark side of human nature, isn't it? Like that self-preservation.
Yeah. It's a natural instinct to protect yourself, even if you're seeing someone else in a really terrible situation.
Yeah. And so Onions is just completely vulnerable on the side of the highway.
Wow.
And he just jumps in front of the next car that approaches.
Oh, my goodness.
And it was a people mover. And it was driven by a woman named Joanne Berry.
Okay.
And she stopped. And Onion's just like, gets in the car and is just screaming that Milat has a gun.
Gosh.
And so, that's such a different reaction than the other cars that just drove off.
Yeah, totally. She was just like immediately understood how serious it was and just like took action without even thinking about it.
Yeah, and she drove him straight to the police station in Barima
Okay.
to report what had happened. But here's the really important part. The police didn't apprehend Milat.
Oh, wow. So even after all of that, he wasn't caught.
That's pretty shocking, isn't it? It makes you wonder if things had gone differently at that point. Maybe the later tragedies could have been prevented.
Right. Yeah. It's really chilling to think about. So we need to actually jump back in time a little bit now.
Okay.
To December 30th, 1989, which is the date that Deborah Everist and James Gibson disappeared.
Right.
They were both 19 years old. They had left Melbourne, traveled to Sydney, and were planning to hitchhike to Albury.
Gotcha.
And so their disappearance is really like the start of, the murders that we know about.
Okay.
And the day after they were last seen, a bushwalker found James Gibson's camera.
Oh, wow.
At Galston Gorge, which is way off the route that they were planning to take.
Right. So already that's a pretty bad sign.
Yeah. And then about a month later, his empty backpack was also found in the same area.
Wow.
And so that was when their disappearance was officially linked to a missing persons report.
Okay.
But it would be quite a while until their fate was known.
So what happened next? It wasn't until October 5th, 1993, that their remains were found in the Belanglo State Forest.
Oh, no.
And they had both been repeatedly stabbed.
Oh, gosh.
So that, sadly became kind of a pattern in these murders.
Yeah, it's just awful.
So then, moving forward to September 6, 1991, we have Diane Pinocchio. She was 29 years old and a mother.
Okay.
And she traveled to the Lake George Hotel in Bungendore. And she told a friend that she was planning to hitchhike back to Queanbeyan.
Okay.
And she left the motel alone around 11 p.m.
Right.
And so, this shows how vulnerable hitchhikers were.
Absolutely. Especially at that time when Milat was active.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And then her body was found on November 13, 1991.
Oh, gosh.
By some forestry commission employees in the Belanglo State Forest.
Oh, wow.
And she was found face down, she was wrapped in pine branches, and she was only wearing underwear and trousers.
Gosh, that's terrible.
Yeah, and she had a stab wound to her 7th thoracic vertebra.
That specific detail is really unsettling. It makes you think it was intentional.
Yeah, definitely. And the way her clothing was found, that suggests that she had been sexually assaulted.
Right. Another layer of horror to this.
Exactly. And then there was Simone Schmidl. She was a 21-year-old German backpacker.
Okay.
And she was last seen in Sydney.
Right.
And she was intending to hitchhike to Melbourne.
Gotcha.
And this was on January 20, 1991.
Right.
And so sadly, this just shows how these crimes really had an international impact.
It really does.
These young people traveling to Australia just wanting to explore.
Yeah.
And they just became so vulnerable to this predator.
Right.
And then her skeleton was found on November 1st, 1993, in a clearing in the Belanglo State Forest.
Oh, wow.
And she had been repeatedly stabbed in the back, and her spinal cord had been cut.
Oh, my gosh.
And there was even evidence suggesting that the killer had returned to the site after her death.
Oh, that is so creepy. That suggests a real sense of, ownership and maybe even a twisted kind of fascination.
Yeah. Then, December 26, 1991, is the last time anyone saw Gabor Neugebauer and Anja Habschied. They were a German couple in their early 20s.
Okay.
And they left Sydney planning to hitchhike to Mildura.
Right.
And, you'd think that as a couple traveling together, they might be less of a target.
You would think so, yeah.
But sadly, they also became victims.
Gosh.
And it just shows, just how violent Milat was and that he was willing to target multiple people.
Yeah, it really does.
So their skeletons were found on November 4th, 1993, in shallow graves in the Belanglo State Forest.
Wow.
Gabor had been shot in the head 6 times.
Oh, my gosh.
And Anja had been decapitated.
Oh, wow. That's just brutal.
And her head was never found.
Oh, that's awful. And your sources say court records show signs of sexual interference with most of the victims, and police thought the killer was bisexual.
Right. And then, in April 1992, Caroline Clarke and Joanne Walters, who were British backpackers, disappeared.
Right, and their bodies were the first to be discovered, right?
Yeah.
Which really brought the whole thing to light.
Exactly.
And started the investigation.
Exactly. So their bodies were found on the Belanglo State Forest in 1993. We don't have the exact date here.
Okay. But that discovery was really what changed everything.
Yeah. It turned it from a missing persons case to, a recognized series of murders
Yeah.
and really ramped up the investigation.
Right.
And what's amazing is that it was Paul Onions, who by now was back in England,
Mm-hmm.
who recognized the similarities between the news reports of the Belanglo murders and what had happened to him back in 1990.
Wow, his memory was amazing.
Yeah.
And he was brave enough to come forward with that information.
Yeah. And so on November 13th, 1993, he contacted the Australian embassy and then the New South Wales police.
Oh, wow.
But like we mentioned earlier, his tip kind of got lost in the huge number of leads the police were getting.
Right. So it took a while for it to resurface.
Yeah. So it wasn't until April 13, 1994, that the police rediscovered his information.
Okay.
And that was like a major turning point. And so things really started moving then. The subsequent arrest of Milat and the raids on his property, as well as the homes of his mother and brothers, it yielded a gold mine of evidence.
Wow, really?
Guns, including a .22 rifle linked to the murders, clothing, and belongings of the victims, backpacks, camping gear, even cameras. It was all there. And the sheer volume and the brazen display of these items, even personal belongings with victims' names, it really speaks volumes about Milat's chilling sense of impunity.
Yeah.
It gives you a key insight into his psychopathy.
What's staggering is how much of this evidence was seemingly just out in the open, right?
Yeah.
It speaks to a certain arrogance, a belief that he would never be caught. The fact that some of the possessions even had the victims' names on them is just chilling.
It's chilling. And the attack on Paul Onions, that single terrifying encounter and his courageous escape, it provided the vital piece of the puzzle.
It did.
It allowed the police to finally apprehend Ivan Milat. And then just a few weeks later, on May 31st, Ivan Milat was charged with the murders of the 7 backpackers.
Wow. And that was a result of so much work by those investigative teams.
Yeah, they finally had their suspect.
They did.
So the trial began and lasted for a very long 18 weeks.
Wow.
And on July 27, 1996, the jury found Ivan Milat guilty of all 7 murders.
Wow. So justice was served.
Yeah, and he received a life sentence for each murder without the possibility of parole,
Oh, wow.
as well as sentences for the attempted murder, false imprisonment, and robbery of Paul Onions.
Right. So he was never getting out.
Nope. And then many years later, on October 27, 2019, Ivan Milat died in Long Bay Correctional Center at the age of 74.
Okay.
He died from esophagus and stomach cancer, and he never admitted to any of the crimes.
Oh, so he never gave the families any closure.
No. And his death, it's the end of his life, but the impact of his crimes and the pain that he inflicted on so many people is just immense.
It really is a tragic story all around.
Yeah. And it really makes you think, doesn't it, about all those points in the timeline. Like, what if things had been different?
Absolutely.
What if Paul Onion's initial report had been taken more seriously? Could things have turned out differently?
It's definitely something to ponder.
It is. And we'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Please share your reactions in the comments section below.
Yeah, let's discuss.
And thanks for being with us today as we went through this really important timeline.